Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the remote farmlands of Ohio. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1892 brought an early frost to the rolling hills of Meigs County, Ohio. The harvest had been poor, and the isolation that came with the approaching winter seemed to settle over the scattered homesteads like a heavy blanket. It was in this desolate landscape that one of the most perplexing cases in regional history would unfold, leaving behind questions that would haunt investigators for decades to come. According to municipal records preserved in the Meigs County Historical Society, the property in question belonged to Cordelia Ashworth, a widow of 43 years, who had lived alone since the death of her husband Jeremiah in the spring of 1890. The farm, located approximately 8 miles northeast of Pomeroy, along what was then known as Township Road 7, consisted of 87 acres of mostly arable land, a modest two-story farmhouse built in 1867, and various outbuildings typical of a working homestead of that era. Cordelia Ashworth was, by most contemporary accounts, an unremarkable woman. The daughter of German immigrants who had settled in the area during the 1840s, she had married Jeremiah Ashworth in 1871 and spent the following 19 years managing the household while her husband worked the farm. Neighbors described her as quiet, competent, and somewhat reserved. She attended services irregularly at the Methodist Church in Pomeroy, maintained minimal social connections, and was known to be entirely self-sufficient in the management of her property following her husband's death from pneumonia. The events that would transform this ordinary widow into the subject of enduring speculation began on November 14, 1892, with the arrival of 2 traveling salesmen at her isolated farmhouse. According to a detailed account recorded by Sheriff Zebediah Morse in his official report, filed 3 days later, and preserved in the county courthouse archives, the men were identified as Silas Fairchild, age 34, and Matthias Crane, 29, both residents of Columbus who had been working the rural counties as peddlers of household goods and patent medicines. The 2 men had been traveling together for approximately 6 months, moving from farm to farm with a horse-drawn wagon containing their wares. Local merchants in nearby towns had reported interactions with the pair throughout October and early November. By all accounts, they were experienced in their trade, polite in their dealings, and had established a reputation for honest business practices. Samuel Whitmore, whose farm neighbored the Ashworth property, later told investigators that he had purchased items from the 2 men just 3 days before their visit to Cordelia's farm and found them to be decent fellows, if a bit worn down by the road. What makes the events of November 14th particularly significant is not what was witnessed, but rather what was discovered in the aftermath. The first indication that something unusual had occurred came from Matthias Crane's horse, which was found wandering loose along Township Road 7 on the morning of November 15th. The animal, still wearing its harness, was spotted by Ezra Whitmore, Samuel's eldest son, as he made his way to town for supplies. The wagon, when located several hundred yards from the Ashworth property, appeared to have been abandoned hastily. Its contents remained undisturbed, but personal effects belonging to both men were scattered in the surrounding brush. Sheriff Morse, summoned by Samuel Whitmore later that morning, proceeded to the Ashworth farm to investigate. What he found there would become the central mystery that defined the case. The farmhouse appeared normal from the outside, with smoke rising from the chimney and the usual signs of occupancy. When Morse knocked on the front door, Cordelia Ashworth answered promptly, dressed in her typical dark wool dress and appearing entirely composed. According to the sheriff's detailed account, written that same evening, his initial conversation with Mrs. Ashworth revealed nothing unusual. She confirmed that two salesmen had visited her property the previous day, stating that she had examined their wares but had not made any purchases. She claimed they had departed in the early evening, thanking her for her time and continuing on their way toward the next farm. Her manner was described as calm and forthcoming, offering no obvious cause for suspicion. However, Morse noted several details that struck him as inconsistent with Mrs. Ashworth's account. The kitchen, which was visible from the front entrance, showed evidence of recent meal preparation for more than one person. 3 bowls sat on the wooden table, and a large pot of what appeared to be vegetable soup remained on the stove, still emanating warmth despite the early afternoon hour. When questioned about the extra settings, Mrs. Ashworth explained that she had been in the habit of preparing larger quantities of food as a matter of efficiency, often saving portions for subsequent meals. The sheriff also observed that the floorboards near the kitchen table appeared to have been recently scrubbed, leaving the wood noticeably lighter in color than the surrounding area. Miss Ashworth explained this as part of her regular cleaning routine, noting that she maintained high standards of household cleanliness. Her explanations were reasonable, delivered without apparent nervousness or contradiction, and accompanied by an invitation for the sheriff to search the property if he deemed it necessary. Morse declined the offer initially, finding no immediate grounds for such an intrusion. However, his subsequent investigation of the abandoned wagon and its contents would reveal details that cast Mrs. Ashworth's account in a more troubling light. Among the personal effects scattered near the wagon were a pocket watch bearing Silas Fairchild's initials, a leather wallet containing Matthias Crane's identification papers, and a modest sum of money. And most significantly, a partially written letter in Fairchild's handwriting. The letter, addressed to a woman named Margaret Fairchild in Columbus, presumably Silas's wife, was dated November 14th and appeared to have been composed during or shortly after the visit to the Ashworth farm. The fragmentary text, preserved in the county archives, read as follows: "My dearest Margaret, we have stopped for the night at a small farm near Pomeroy. The widow here has been most hospitable, inviting us to share her table despite our condition as strangers. She prepares an excellent soup, and the warmth of her kitchen is most welcome after the cold of the road. Matthias speaks of visiting his sister in Chillicothe when we conclude our business in this county, but I confess I grow weary of this traveling life and long for the comfort of our own home. The woman here reminds me somewhat of your late mother in her manner of." The letter ended abruptly, with ink still wet when the paper was discovered, suggesting it had been abandoned very recently. This detail troubled Sheriff Morse considerably, as it contradicted Mrs. Ashworth's claim that the men had departed her property without lingering for a meal. A more thorough search of the area surrounding the abandoned wagon revealed additional disturbing evidence. Approximately 50 yards from the road, partially concealed beneath a pile of fallen leaves, investigators found a blood-stained piece of fabric that appeared to match Matthias Crane's coat, based on descriptions provided by merchants who had dealt with the men in recent weeks. The quantity of blood suggested a significant injury, though the fabric's location raised questions about how it had come to be separated from its owner and discarded in such a location. When confronted with this evidence during a second interview on November 16th, Mrs. Ashworth maintained her previous account, but appeared notably less composed than during the initial questioning. She claimed no knowledge of how the men's belongings had come to be scattered along the road, suggesting they might have been robbed by brigands after leaving her property. However, she could not explain why valuable items such as the wallet and pocket watch had been left behind, as this was inconsistent with the typical patterns of highway robbery in the region. Dr. Cornelius Webb, the county's medical examiner, was summoned to examine the blood-stained fabric and provide his professional assessment of the nature and extent of the injury it might represent. His report, filed on November 18th, concluded that the blood was indeed human and that the quantity present suggested a wound of considerable severity, though not necessarily fatal. The pattern of the staining indicated that the blood had been deposited while wet, meaning the injury had occurred recently and the victim had bled actively onto the fabric. More troubling still was Dr. Webb's observation that the edges of the fabric appeared to have been cut rather than torn, suggesting that someone had deliberately removed this piece from the garment rather than it being separated by accident or during a struggle. This detail implied a level of calculation that was difficult to reconcile with either an accidental injury or a crime of passion committed by strangers. The investigation took a more sinister turn when Sheriff Morse decided to examine the Ashworth property more thoroughly, despite Mrs. Ashworth's increasingly agitated protests that such a search was unnecessary and intrusive. On November 19th, accompanied by Dr. Webb and 2 deputy sheriffs from Pomeroy, Morse conducted a comprehensive examination of the farmhouse and its immediate surroundings. The interior of the house revealed several anomalies that had not been apparent during the initial visit. The cellar, accessed through a door adjacent to the kitchen, showed clear signs of recent disturbance. The dirt floor had been freshly turned in several places, and the overall appearance suggested that significant digging had occurred within the past few days. When questioned about this activity, Mrs. Ashworth explained that she had been reorganizing her food storage areas in preparation for winter, moving root vegetables and preserves to different locations within the cellar. However, Dr. Webb noted that the pattern of disturbed earth was inconsistent with the storage of foodstuffs. The areas that had been excavated were of irregular size and depth, and some appeared to be located in sections of the cellar that would be impractical for storage purposes due to poor drainage and limited accessibility. Most significantly, several of these excavated areas showed evidence of having been filled and then re-excavated multiple times, suggesting a level of activity far beyond what would be required for simple reorganization. A more detailed examination of the kitchen revealed additional troubling evidence. Behind the large iron stove, investigators found several fragments of fabric and bone that appeared to be the remains of burned materials. The bone fragments, when examined by Dr. Webb, were confirmed to be of mammalian origin, though their size and characteristics made it impossible to determine their specific source without more advanced analysis techniques than were available at the time. Mrs. Ashworth's explanation for these materials was that she regularly burned kitchen scraps and bones from butchered animals as a matter of waste disposal. However, the investigators noted that the quantity of bone fragments seemed excessive for normal household waste, and the presence of fabric remnants suggested that items other than food waste had been disposed of in this manner. During this extended search, one of the deputy sheriffs made a discovery that would fundamentally alter the nature of the investigation. While examining the barn located approximately 100 feet from the main house, Deputy Sheriff Marcus Bentley found what appeared to be a makeshift grave beneath a pile of hay in the building's far corner. The depression in the earth was roughly 6 feet in length and had clearly been excavated and then filled recently, as evidenced by the loose condition of the soil and the absence of the established vegetation that covered the surrounding area. When confronted with this discovery, Mrs. Ashworth became visibly distressed for the first time during the investigation. She claimed that the excavation was a grave for a milk cow that had died the previous week, and that she had been forced to dispose of the animal herself due to her isolation and the lack of assistance from neighbors. However, a partial excavation of the site revealed no animal remains, only loose earth and several personal items that appeared to belong to the missing salesman. Among these items were a set of brass buttons matching those described as being present on Silas Fairchild's coat, a small tin containing what appeared to be patent medicine samples, and most significantly, a pair of men's boots that corresponded to descriptions provided by merchants who had dealt with the travelers. The boots showed signs of having been worn recently, with fresh mud and grass stains consistent with walking across the Ashworth property. The discovery of these items in what Mrs. Ashworth claimed was an animal grave created a significant contradiction in her account of events. If the salesman had departed her property safely, as she maintained, there was no reasonable explanation for how their personal belongings had come to be buried on her land. When pressed for an explanation, Mrs. Ashworth became increasingly incoherent, alternating between maintaining her innocence and making vague references to circumstances beyond her control. Dr. Webb's examination of the excavated area revealed additional troubling details. The soil showed chemical changes consistent with the decomposition of organic matter, and there was a distinct odor emanating from the deeper layers of earth that suggested the presence of biological materials. However, no human remains were found despite extensive excavation, leading to speculation about whether the bodies had been removed to another location or disposed of through other means. The investigation expanded to include a detailed examination of Mrs. Ashworth's background and recent activities. Interviews with neighbors revealed that she had been observed making several trips to and from her property during unusual hours in the weeks leading up to November 14th. Samuel Whitmore reported seeing lights in her barn late at night on multiple occasions, which struck him as odd since Mrs. Ashworth typically maintained a very regular schedule and retired early each evening. More significantly, several neighbors reported that Mrs. Ashworth had approached them in recent weeks, seeking to purchase various tools and supplies that seemed unrelated to typical farming activities. She had specifically inquired about obtaining lime, which was commonly used for soil improvement, but also had applications in the disposal of organic waste. She had also sought to borrow or purchase heavy-duty shovels, pickaxes, and other implements that would be useful for extensive digging operations. When questioned about these purchases, Mrs. Ashworth provided explanations that were technically plausible, but seemed inconsistent with her established patterns of behavior. She claimed to be planning improvements to her property that would require significant excavation work, but she could not provide specific details about these projects or explain why such work would be undertaken so late in the farming season. The psychological profile that emerged from these interviews painted a picture of a woman who had become increasingly isolated and potentially unstable following her husband's death. Several neighbors noted that Mrs. Ashworth had always been reserved, but her behavior had become noticeably more erratic in recent months. She had been observed talking to herself while working outdoors, and on at least one occasion, Samuel Whitmore had heard her engaged in what appeared to be animated conversation despite being alone on her property. Dr. Webb, who had some experience with cases involving mental disturbance, observed during his interviews with Mrs. Ashworth that she displayed several concerning behavioral patterns. She frequently provided unnecessarily detailed explanations for simple questions, suggesting a heightened anxiety about being believed. She also demonstrated an unusual preoccupation with cleanliness and order, repeatedly mentioning her household standards and expressing concern about the investigators tracking dirt through her home. Most troubling was Mrs. Ashworth's apparent difficulty maintaining consistent eye contact during questioning and her tendency to provide information that had not been requested. When asked about her activities on November 14th, she volunteered detailed descriptions of her cleaning routine, the contents of meals she had prepared, and her impressions of the weather, despite none of these topics being directly relevant to the investigators' questions. The case took another disturbing turn when investigators learned that Silas Fairchild and Matthias Crane were not the first travelers to have gone missing in the vicinity of Mrs. Ashworth's property. A review of county records revealed that at least 3 other individuals had disappeared while traveling through the area over the past 18 months, though these cases had not been connected previously due to the transient nature of the victims and the assumption that they had simply moved on to other regions. The most significant of these earlier disappearances involved a traveling preacher named Reverend Josiah Blackthorne, who had vanished in April 1892 while making his circuit through the rural communities of Meigs County. Blackthorne had been scheduled to conduct services at several small churches in the area, but had failed to appear for his appointments. His horse and wagon had been found abandoned along a road approximately 12 miles from the Ashworth property, but no trace of the man himself had ever been discovered. Investigation into Blackthorne's disappearance revealed that he had been known to accept hospitality from local residents during his travels, and had specifically mentioned his intention to visit isolated homesteads to minister to settlers who were unable to attend regular church services. Several witnesses confirmed that he had been seen traveling in the direction of Mrs. Ashworth's property shortly before his disappearance, though no one could confirm that he had actually arrived there. When questioned about Blackthorne, Mrs. Ashworth claimed no memory of receiving a visit from any preacher. However, during a search of her home, investigators found a small leather-bound Bible bearing Blackthorne's name inscribed on the front cover. Mrs. Ashworth explained this discovery by claiming that she had purchased the Bible from a traveling merchant months earlier and had not noticed the inscription. However, the condition of the book suggested that it had been well used and carefully maintained, which was inconsistent with it being simply a piece of discarded merchandise. The other missing persons cases involved a German immigrant named Heinrich Müller, who had disappeared in September 1892 while traveling to visit relatives in southern Ohio, and a young man named Timothy Ashford, who had vanished in July 1892 while seeking work at various farms in the region. In both cases, personal belongings had been found abandoned along roads within a relatively small geographic area that included Mrs. Ashworth's property. The pattern that emerged from these cases suggested a predatory behavior that went far beyond the opportunistic crime that investigators had initially suspected. The targeting of isolated travelers, the careful disposal of evidence, and the selection of victims who were unlikely to be immediately missed all pointed to a calculated and methodical approach that was deeply disturbing in its implications. Dr. Webb's analysis of the available evidence led him to conclude that Mrs. Ashworth was likely suffering from a severe form of mental derangement that manifested as an inability to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate responses to social situations. He theorized that the isolation of her living situation, combined with the trauma of her husband's death, had gradually eroded her capacity for normal human interaction and led to increasingly antisocial behavior. However, the systematic nature of the evidence disposal and the careful planning that seemed to characterize the crimes suggested a level of cognitive function that contradicted the typical presentation of severe mental illness. Mrs. Ashworth demonstrated clear awareness of the legal consequences of her actions, as evidenced by her attempts to conceal evidence and provide alternative explanations for investigators' discoveries. This contradiction led some investigators to consider the possibility that Mrs. Ashworth's crimes were motivated not by mental incapacity, but by a more calculating desire for personal gain. Analysis of her financial situation revealed that she had been struggling to maintain her property following her husband's death and had accumulated significant debts with local merchants. The money and valuables carried by traveling salesmen and other transients would have represented a substantial temptation for someone in her circumstances. However, the investigation of Mrs. Ashworth's financial records revealed that she had not made any unusual purchases or payments that would suggest an influx of stolen money. Her spending patterns had remained consistent with her limited legitimate income, and there was no evidence that she had attempted to sell any items that might have belonged to her alleged victims. This absence of financial motive forced investigators to consider more disturbing possibilities about Mrs. Ashworth's psychological state. Dr. Webb proposed that her crimes might be driven by a pathological need for human contact combined with an inability to maintain normal social relationships. The isolation of her living situation and the trauma of losing her husband might have created a psychological state where she was compelled to force travelers to remain on her property, resorting to violence when they attempted to leave. This theory was supported by evidence found during a more extensive search of Mrs. Ashworth's home. In a locked trunk in her bedroom, investigators discovered what appeared to be a collection of personal mementos taken from her alleged victims. These included a pocket watch chain, several buttons, a small photograph of an unidentified woman, and various other small personal items that served no practical purpose but might have held sentimental value for their original owners. The psychological profile suggested by this collection indicated an individual who derived emotional satisfaction from maintaining connections to people she had encountered, even when those connections had been established through violence. The careful preservation of these items suggested that Mrs. Ashworth viewed them not as trophies of criminal acts, but as meaningful reminders of human relationships, however briefly established. The investigation also revealed evidence of Mrs. Ashworth's increasingly elaborate efforts to maintain the fiction of normal social interactions. In her kitchen, investigators found place settings for multiple people that were regularly laid out and then cleared away, despite her living alone. Her pantry contained quantities of food that were excessive for a single person, and her daily routine appeared to include conversations with imaginary companions. Neighbors reported that they had occasionally observed Mrs. Ashworth engaged in animated discussions while working in her garden, gesturing and responding as if interacting with other people. At the time, these behaviors had been dismissed as eccentric but harmless habits of a lonely widow. In the context of the investigation, however, they suggested a progressive disconnection from reality that might have made it easier for her to rationalize violence against actual visitors to her property. The most disturbing aspect of Mrs. Ashworth's psychological profile was her apparent ability to compartmentalize her criminal behavior while maintaining a facade of normalcy in other areas of her life. Her interactions with neighbors remained polite and appropriate. She continued to manage her property effectively, and she showed no obvious signs of the guilt or anxiety that would typically accompany such serious crimes. This capacity for compartmentalization suggested a level of psychological sophistication that made her particularly dangerous. Unlike individuals whose mental illness manifested in obvious ways that might warn potential victims, Mrs. Ashworth appeared entirely normal to casual observers and would not have aroused suspicion in the travelers who accepted her invitations for hospitality. As the investigation progressed, the question of what had ultimately become of the missing men's bodies became increasingly pressing. The absence of remains at the excavated sites on Mrs. Ashworth's property suggested either that the bodies had been moved to other locations or that they had been disposed of through methods that left no trace. The presence of ash and bone fragments in her stove raised the disturbing possibility that she had attempted to destroy evidence through burning, though the complete elimination of human remains through this method would have been practically impossible with the equipment available to her. Dr. Webb's examination of the bone fragments found behind the stove revealed that they were too degraded to provide definitive identification, but their size and characteristics were consistent with human origin. Chemical analysis of the ash residue detected traces of materials that might have come from burned clothing or personal effects, supporting the theory that Mrs. Ashworth had attempted to destroy evidence of her crimes. The investigation of the surrounding area revealed several additional sites where earth had been disturbed, suggesting that Mrs. Ashworth had experimented with different methods of concealing evidence. Some of these locations showed signs of having been excavated and then abandoned, possibly because the soil conditions were unsuitable for her purposes, or because she had been interrupted during the process. The pattern of these excavation sites indicated a level of planning and preparation that contradicted any theory of spontaneous violence. Mrs. Ashworth appeared to have spent considerable time and effort developing methods for disposing of evidence, suggesting that her crimes were premeditated rather than impulsive responses to unexpected situations. On November 23rd, after 9 days of investigation, Sheriff Morse made the decision to arrest Mrs. Ashworth on suspicion of murder, despite the absence of bodies or definitive proof of death. The circumstantial evidence was compelling, and the risk of allowing her to remain free while continuing the investigation was deemed unacceptable. Mrs. Ashworth's response to her arrest was notably calm, almost resigned. She did not protest her innocence or demand legal representation, instead asking only if she would be permitted to make arrangements for the care of her livestock. This reaction struck investigators as inconsistent with that of an innocent person facing false accusations, and seemed to confirm their suspicions about her involvement in the disappearances. During her initial questioning in custody, Mrs. Ashworth provided a more detailed account of the events of November 14th, though her version of events remained contradictory in several key aspects. She admitted that Silas Fairchild and Matthias Crane had indeed shared a meal at her home, acknowledging that her initial denial had been motivated by a desire to avoid becoming involved in what she assumed was a routine missing persons investigation. According to this revised account, the two men had arrived at her property in the late afternoon, seeking shelter for the night. She had invited them to share her evening meal and had prepared soup and bread for the three of them. The conversation had been pleasant, with the men sharing stories of their travels and expressing appreciation for her hospitality. Mrs. Ashworth claimed that the men had departed her property early the following morning, thanking her for her kindness and continuing on their intended route toward Pomeroy. She maintained that she had no knowledge of what might have happened to them after they left her farm, and suggested that they might have encountered trouble from other sources during their continued travels. However, this account remained inconsistent with the physical evidence found at the scene, particularly the scattered personal belongings and the blood-stained fabric. When confronted with these discrepancies, Mrs. Ashworth became increasingly vague in her responses, claiming that her memory of the specific details was unclear due to the stress of the investigation. More significantly, her revised account did not address the evidence found in her cellar and barn, including the personal items buried beneath the hay and the recent excavation activity. When pressed for explanations of these discoveries, Mrs. Ashworth claimed that she could not account for how the items had come to be on her property and suggested that they might have been planted there by someone seeking to incriminate her. This suggestion of a conspiracy against her struck investigators as implausible, given the isolated nature of her property and the lack of any apparent motive for someone to frame her for crimes she had not committed. The logistics of planting evidence in multiple locations on her property without her knowledge would have been extremely difficult, particularly given her established pattern of maintaining close supervision over her surroundings. During subsequent interviews, Mrs. Ashworth's mental state appeared to deteriorate progressively. She began to contradict herself within the same conversation, providing different versions of events without apparent awareness of the inconsistencies. She also started to make references to voices and instructions that seemed to come from sources she could not identify, suggesting a possible progression of her underlying mental illness. Dr. Webb's evaluation of Mrs. Ashworth's psychological condition concluded that she was experiencing a severe form of dissociative disorder that made it difficult for her to maintain a coherent sense of reality. He theorized that the trauma of committing multiple murders had created a psychological fracture that allowed her to maintain separate and contradictory belief systems about her own actions. This psychological profile suggested that Mrs. Ashworth might have genuinely believed her own denials of involvement in the crimes, despite the overwhelming evidence against her. The compartmentalization that had allowed her to function normally while committing acts of violence might have evolved into a complete disconnection from the reality of her criminal behavior. However, the legal system of 1892 had limited capacity for dealing with complex psychological issues, and the focus of the prosecution remained on the physical evidence and the pattern of disappearances associated with Mrs. Ashworth's property. The absence of bodies complicated the legal proceedings, but the accumulation of circumstantial evidence was deemed sufficient to support charges of murder in the first degree. The trial of Cordelia Ashworth began on February 14, 1893, in the Meigs County Courthouse in Pomeroy. The proceedings attracted significant attention from regional newspapers, which characterized the case as one of the most shocking crimes in recent memory. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Harrison Webb, focused on the systematic nature of the evidence disposal and the pattern of disappearances that suggested premeditated murder. The defense, provided by court-appointed attorney Samuel Morrison, argued that the absence of bodies made it impossible to prove that murders had actually occurred and suggested that the missing men might have simply abandoned their belongings and left the area for reasons unrelated to Mrs. Ashworth. Morrison also introduced Dr. Webb's psychological evaluation as evidence that Mrs. Ashworth lacked the mental capacity to plan and execute the complex crimes attributed to her. The prosecution countered with testimony from multiple witnesses who established the timeline of the disappearances and the discovery of evidence on Mrs. Ashworth's property. Sheriff Morse provided detailed descriptions of the excavation sites and the personal belongings found buried on the farm. Dr. Webb testified about the blood evidence and the bone fragments found in the stove, though he acknowledged that definitive identification was not possible with available techniques. The most damaging testimony came from Samuel Whitmore, who described his observations of Mrs. Ashworth's unusual nocturnal activities in the weeks preceding the disappearances. His account of seeing lights in her barn during late hours, combined with her requests to purchase excavation tools and lime, created a compelling picture of someone engaged in suspicious preparation for unknown activities. The defense's attempts to present Mrs. Ashworth's psychological condition as a mitigating factor were hampered by the legal standards of the era, which required a much higher threshold of mental incapacity for an insanity defense than would be recognized today. Dr. Webb's testimony about her dissociative disorder was viewed with skepticism by jurors who had little understanding of complex psychological conditions. Mrs. Ashworth herself testified in her own defense, maintaining her innocence and providing a confused and contradictory account of the events in question. Her testimony revealed the extent of her psychological deterioration, as she frequently lost track of her narrative and made statements that were clearly inconsistent with established facts. While this behavior supported the defense's argument about her mental incapacity, it also made her appear unreliable and potentially deceptive to the jury. The trial concluded on February 28, 1893, with the jury deliberating for less than 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on multiple counts of murder in the first degree. The brevity of their deliberations suggested that they found the circumstantial evidence compelling, despite the absence of bodies or eyewitness testimony to the actual crimes. Mrs. Ashworth's sentencing hearing was scheduled for March 15, 1893, but she never appeared in court for that proceeding. On the morning of March 10th, she was found dead in her jail cell, apparently having taken her own life using a piece of fabric torn from her clothing. A note found beside her body contained only the words, "The soup was always warm for anyone who came to my door." The ambiguity of this final statement added another layer of mystery to an already perplexing case. It could be interpreted as a final assertion of her innocence, suggesting that she had indeed offered hospitality to the missing travelers and bore no responsibility for their disappearances. Alternatively, it might have been a cryptic confession, acknowledging that she had used the promise of food and shelter to lure victims to their deaths. Dr. Webb's post-mortem analysis of Mrs. Ashworth's psychological state suggested that her suicide was consistent with the progression of her underlying mental illness. The stress of the trial and the prospect of execution had apparently overwhelmed her already fragile psychological defenses, leading to a complete breakdown that made continued existence unbearable. The investigation into the disappearances officially concluded with Mrs. Ashworth's death, though the absence of recovered bodies meant that many questions remained unanswered. The personal belongings found on her property were returned to the families of the missing men, providing some closure but no complete resolution to their grief. The Ashworth farm was sold at auction in April 1893, with the proceeds used to satisfy her debts and provide modest compensation to the victims' families. The property was purchased by a farming family from neighboring Athens County, who demolished the existing structures and built a new farmhouse in a different location on the land, apparently uncomfortable with occupying the buildings where the crimes were believed to have occurred. In subsequent years, the case became the subject of considerable local folklore and speculation. The absence of a complete confession or recovered bodies allowed for various theories about what had actually transpired on the isolated farm. Some accounts suggested that Mrs. Ashworth had been the victim of a conspiracy and that the real perpetrators had escaped justice. Others proposed that the missing men had been involved in criminal activities themselves and had disappeared to avoid prosecution for other crimes. The most persistent theory, however, held that Mrs. Ashworth had indeed committed the crimes attributed to her, but had been driven to do so by circumstances beyond her control. Proponents of this view argued that the isolation and hardship of frontier life, combined with the trauma of losing her husband, had created psychological pressures that made violence inevitable. Dr. Webb's continuing research into the psychological aspects of the case led him to develop one of the earliest systematic studies of what would later be recognized as serial killing behavior. His analysis of Mrs. Ashworth's methods and motivations provided insights that would influence criminal psychology for decades, though his work remained largely unknown outside of academic circles. In 1895, Dr. Webb published a paper titled Isolation and Criminal Behavior, a study of rural homicide in the American Journal of Mental Science, using the Ashworth case as a primary example. His work was among the first to suggest that certain individuals might be predisposed to commit multiple murders when placed in specific environmental circumstances, a theory that would not gain widespread acceptance for several more decades. The paper also explored the role of social isolation in the development of antisocial behavior, arguing that the lack of regular human contact could lead to a progressive degeneration of normal social inhibitions. Dr. Webb proposed that Mrs. Ashworth's crimes might have begun as genuine attempts to establish human connections, only becoming violent when her psychological needs could not be satisfied through normal social interaction. This analysis suggested that the tragedy of the Ashworth case lay not only in the loss of innocent lives, but also in the failure of the community to recognize and address the psychological distress that had led to the crimes. Dr. Webb argued that earlier intervention, perhaps in the form of regular social contact or psychological support following her husband's death, might have prevented the progression toward violence. However, the practical application of such insights was limited by the resources and understanding available in rural communities of the 1890s. The concept of preventive mental health care was virtually unknown, and the stigma associated with psychological problems made it unlikely that someone like Mrs. Ashworth would have sought help, even if it had been available. The long-term impact of the case extended beyond its immediate legal and psychological implications. The disappearance of multiple travelers in a small geographic area created a climate of suspicion and fear that affected the region for years afterward. Merchants and other itinerant workers became reluctant to travel through Meigs County, particularly to isolated farmsteads where they might be vulnerable to attack. This economic impact was felt most severely by the farming families who depended on traveling salesmen for access to goods and services that were not available in local communities. The reputation of the area as dangerous led to a gradual decline in commercial activity that contributed to the economic stagnation that characterized much of rural Ohio in the late 19th century. The social impact was equally significant, as the case reinforced stereotypes about the dangers posed by individuals living in isolation. The image of the murderous hermit became a powerful element in regional folklore, influencing attitudes toward social outsiders and contributing to the stigmatization of anyone who chose to live apart from established communities. In 1952, nearly 60 years after Mrs. Ashworth's death, construction workers building a new county highway discovered human remains buried in a remote section of the former Ashworth property. The bones were severely degraded and could not be definitively identified, but their location and the presence of fabric fragments suggested a connection to the original case. Dr. James Morrison, the county coroner and grandson of Mrs. Ashworth's defense attorney, conducted an examination of the remains using techniques that had not been available during the original investigation. His analysis confirmed that the bones were human and belonged to at least 2 individuals, both adult males. The condition of the remains suggested that they had been buried for approximately 60 years, consistent with the timeline of the original disappearances. This discovery provided a degree of closure to families who had never learned the fate of their missing relatives, though it also raised new questions about the extent of Mrs. Ashworth's crimes. The location of the burial site, more than a mile from her farmhouse and accessible only through dense woodland, suggested a level of planning and physical capability that had not been evident in the original investigation. The remote location also implied that Mrs. Ashworth had been familiar with the surrounding terrain and had specifically chosen a burial site that would be unlikely to be discovered accidentally. This degree of premeditation contradicted some of the theories about her mental state and suggested that her crimes had been more calculated than previously believed. In 1967, Dr. Morrison published a comprehensive review of the case that incorporated both the original evidence and the more recent discovery of remains. His analysis concluded that Cordelia Ashworth had likely been responsible for the deaths of at least 6 individuals over a period of approximately 2 years, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in Ohio history. Dr. Morrison's work also explored the social and economic factors that had contributed to the crimes, arguing that the isolation and hardship of frontier life created conditions that could trigger violent behavior in susceptible individuals. He proposed that similar cases had probably occurred in other rural areas but had not been documented due to the limited law enforcement resources and communication systems of the era. The psychological profile that emerged from Dr. Morrison's analysis suggested that Mrs. Ashworth had suffered from a complex combination of mental disorders that manifested as an inability to form normal social relationships combined with a compulsive need for human contact. The violence appeared to have been a means of preventing visitors from leaving her property, allowing her to maintain the illusion of social connection for as long as possible. This analysis was supported by evidence found during the 1952 excavation, including personal belongings that had been carefully preserved and buried with the remains. The presence of these items suggested that Mrs. Ashworth had viewed her victims not as objects of hatred or fear, but as valued companions whose departure represented an intolerable loss. The case of Cordelia Ashworth ultimately became recognized as one of the earliest documented examples of serial killing in American criminal history, though this recognition came long after the events themselves had faded from public memory. The psychological complexity of her crimes and the social factors that contributed to their occurrence provided insights that influenced the development of modern criminal psychology and forensic investigation techniques. The tragedy of the missing travelers and the widow who killed them serves as a reminder of the isolation and desperation that characterized much of rural American life in the late 19th century. It also illustrates the limitations of the legal and mental health systems of that era in dealing with complex psychological problems that manifested as criminal behavior. Today, the former Ashworth property is marked only by a small historical marker placed by the Meigs County Historical Society in 1992, 100 years after the original crimes. The marker provides a brief summary of the case, but omits many of the disturbing details that made it one of the most troubling episodes in regional history. The soup pot that was found warm on Mrs. Ashworth's stove that November day in 1892 became a symbol of the deceptive hospitality that had lured innocent travelers to their deaths. The image of a meal prepared with apparent care and generosity, used as a tool for murder, captured the essential horror of crimes that violated the basic trust that made community life possible. The final words found beside Cordelia Ashworth's body in her jail cell continue to resonate more than a century after they were written. Whether they represented a final assertion of innocence, a cryptic confession, or simply the confused thoughts of a mind destroyed by isolation and guilt, they serve as a haunting reminder that some truths remain forever buried with those who carried them to their graves. And perhaps it is appropriate that certain questions remain unanswered, for the complete truth about what occurred in that isolated farmhouse might be more disturbing than the mystery itself. In the end, we are left with the image of a warm pot of soup on a cold autumn evening, and the terrible knowledge that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from strangers in the darkness, but from the lonely souls who invite us into their homes and ask only that we never leave.